Good morning, fifth grade. So we are going to look at Chapter 8, Lesson 3. What was it like to live during the Civil War? So we're going to start with our timeline on this page here for us. Starting with April of 1862, we have the Confederacy issues draft. March of 1863, we have the Union issues draft. April of 1863, we have Richmond bread riots occur. So if we take a look at this picture here, we can see a Union soldier and a Confederate soldier. And we can just kind of take a quick look at what the differences would be in their uniforms. Fairly similar in their weapons and different items that they would have on, but you can clearly see that the Union soldiers wore more of a blue color and the Confederate soldiers are more of a tan or brownish gray color. So let's go ahead and get started with the reading. So again, Chapter 8, Lesson 3 is what was it like to live during the Civil War? So these different struggles that we're going to go through. So starting with Civil War soldiers. In some ways, Union soldiers and the Confederate soldiers who met on the battlefield in the Civil War were similar. Both groups were eager to join the Army at the start of the war. Most soldiers on each side were under the age of 30. Teenage boys were part of each army too. Some worked as drummer boys, but others lied about their age so they could enlist as soldiers. Many Union and Confederate soldiers worked as farmers before the war, but each side included men from a variety of occupations. Both the Union forces and the Confederate forces also included men who were not born in the United States. Despite these similarities, the Union and the Confederate troops found themselves on opposite sides of a brutal conflict. The Union soldiers wore blue uniforms, while the Confederate soldiers wore mainly gray, especially later in the war. The Union forces called the Southern forces rebels, and the Confederates called the troops from the North Yankees. The Union and Confederate troops had different strengths. The Southerners had more experience in shooting, hunting, and riding. They also had a strong military background, with 7 of the nation's 8 military schools located in the South. The Union troops had less experience but more funding. They also had better access to supplies, since 80% of the nation's factories were located in the North. Okay, choosing sides. So you can see this is events in Kansas reflected the split loyalties of the nation. Geography determined loyalties for many soldiers in the Civil War. Most Northerners fought for the Union, and most Southerners fought for the Confederacy. For others, choosing sides was difficult. This choice was especially difficult in the border states. The border states were Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and West Virginia. These states allowed slavery and did not support Lincoln in the election of 1860. Even so, they did not secede from the Union with the other slave states. Officially, the border states remained part of the Union. However, men from border states enlisted in both sides of the conflict. This split some families and communities apart. Brothers fought against brothers. Fathers fought against their sons. Neighbors fought against their neighbors. Did you know that conflict over choosing sides even affected the president's family? Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, was from Kentucky. When war broke out and people were deciding which side to fight for, some people in her family chose to fight for the Confederacy. Critics from the North questioned the First Lady's loyalty to the Union. Southerners considered her a traitor. We have Native Americans in the Civil War. Native Americans fought on both sides of the Civil War. Some, such as the Delaware people, stayed loyal to the Union. Others, such as the Cherokee, joined the Confederacy because some members of the Cherokee Nation were slaveholders. Native American groups hoped that participating in the war would encourage positive relationships with the government. Tragically, unfair treatment of Native Americans continued both during and after the war. No matter which side they chose during the war, Native Americans came out on the losing end. The war claimed many lives. The Cherokee, for example, lost thousands of members. Groups that signed treaties with the Confederates fought that their agreements were not honored. Furthermore, the Union punished those tribes that had joined the Confederacy by relocating them or even with executions. Native American groups loyal to the Union didn't fare much better. The Delaware people, for example, had already been relocated from the East Coast to Kansas. Then, after the war, they lost even this land and were forced to move into present-day Oklahoma. John Ross was the chief of the Cherokee during the Civil War. As the war progressed, some Cherokee felt that they should side with the Union. Ross wrote letters to Abraham Lincoln to explain the Cherokee Nation's new position and asked the Union president for support. He asked for ample military protection for life and property, along with a recognition by the government of the obligations of the existing treaties. So here in this picture, we have John Ross, which was the chief of the Cherokee people at the time. All right, continuing on with the reality of war. In the early days of the war, men were eager to prove their patriotism by joining the Union or Confederate forces. Many believed the conflict would be resolved within a few short months, so volunteers did not hesitate to enlist. Life in military camps quickly spoiled their dreams of easily won glory. On average, soldiers fought only 1 day a month or less, so most of the time was spent at camp. Food was bad and sometimes even harmful. Diseases spread easily to unsanitary living conditions. In fact, twice as many soldiers died from disease than were killed on the battlefields. Soldiers struggled with boredom and sought ways to fill their time. Many spent hours writing letters to their loved ones, sharing their feelings and details about the hardships of war. So the pictures here says soldiers on both sides wrote letters home. Union and Confederate soldiers alike were afraid that their bodies would not be able to be identified if they fell during battle. Neither army included identification tags in their uniforms, so many soldiers would write their names on a scrap of paper and pin it to their clothing. At the bottom picture here, we have a Civil War doctor kit. As the war dragged on, losses grew, and fewer men were willing to volunteer. Both sides issued a draft, or selection of men who were required to serve in the military. On April 16th of 1862, The Confederate Congress passed a law at the request of President Jefferson Davis. The law extended the enlistment of current soldiers by 3 years and required all white male citizens between the ages of 18 and 35 in southern states to enlist for a minimum of 3 years. Within a year, the Union called for its own draft. The Enrollment Act of 1863 required all male citizens between the ages of 20 and 45, including immigrants who planned to become citizens, to join the Union forces. So remember, a draft is them forcing people to join the military. Right? They're being drafted to come and join and serve. So both the Union and Confederacy made exceptions that allowed some men to avoid enlisting in the military. The Confederacy passed a law in October of 1862 that allowed slaveholders with 20 or more enslaved people to avoid the draft. Many Southerners resented the law, believing it favored wealthy slaveholders. Similarly, in the Union, the Enrollment Act of 1863 gave wealthy Northern men the option to avoid the draft. A man could avoid the draft by paying $300 to another man to serve for him. This option led to riots in northern cities, since most citizens couldn't afford to avoid the draft. So here we have a primary source. Remember, a primary source is someone who was there at the time or something that was there at the time that this was happening. So this is from a letter dated September 21st of 1862. In their words, Confederate Private Alexander Hunter. We went hungry. For 6 days, not a morsel of bread or meat had gone in our stomachs. Our menu consisted of apple and corn. We toasted, we burned, we stewed, we boiled. We roasted these two together and singly until there was not a man whose form had not caved in. Our underclothes were foul and hanging in strips, our socks worn out, and half of the men were barefooted. Many were lame and were sent to the rear. Many became ill from exposure and starvation and were left on the road. So this is from the Confederate private, so a Confederate soldier, Alexander Hunter, and he's talking about how they didn't have enough food to feed the men, how their clothing was ragged, and how everyone was starving and becoming sick and not able to continue on during the war. So at this point, it seemed that the Union strategy of cutting off supplies to the Confederacy was working. Continuing on with the war efforts. So here in this picture, it says Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper printed this drawing of Richmond bread riots on May 23rd of 1863. Let's read a little bit about that. Civilians on both sides worked hard to support the war efforts. Women worked in factories, ran shops, and labored on farms. Resources were stretched thin as each side tried to support the troops' needs. Because the Union controlled most of the railroads and coastal ports, food became scarce in the South. Prices rose to 10 times higher than they were in 1861. On April 2nd of 1863, in Richmond, Virginia, a group of more than 100 women demanded that the governor, John Letcher, find a solution to the food shortage. He failed to help. Hundreds of armed civilians joined the crowd, and a riot began. They looted the government food storehouses and nearby shops, shouting, "Bread or blood." Letcher and Jefferson Davis threatened to respond with force, and the women went home. American women also worked as professional nurses for the first time during the Civil War. Clara Barton was one such woman. Barton served as a battlefield nurse, taking care of the wounded. She also founded the American Red Cross in 1881. Nurses took care of troops outside of the battlefield as well. Schools, churches, and homes were turned into makeshift hospitals because most of the country lacked any healthcare system. Women who volunteered at these hospitals often treated Union and Confederate soldiers alike. So this picture here, it says female volunteers treated patients on the battlefield and in makeshift hospitals. So they used, again, schools, churches, homes nearby, and they made those into hospitals to treat the soldiers. Some women wanted to join the fight. There were two ways women became involved in active duty. Women were barred from enlisting, but some disguised themselves as men and became soldiers. For example, Frances Clayton served with the 4th Missouri Artillery and was wounded twice in battle. Other women served as spies. Rose O'Neal Greenhow and Belle Boyd worked as Confederate spies. These women sent messages about the Union's plans to the Confederate Army. Greenhow also helped the Confederacy gain financial support in Europe. Remember, we read about here Greenhow yesterday in our inquiry journal. Harriet Tubman, well-known abolitionist and conductor on the Underground Railroad, was a spy for the Union and even helped lead soldiers through the South. So here we have Frances Clayton, who disguised herself as a man to fight for the Union. So here she is dressed as a woman. Here she is dressed as a soldier, as a disguise. Continuing on with the African American experience. Life for African Americans during the Civil War varied depending on their location. African Americans in the South were enslaved. Slaveholders volunteered enslaved people to serve as cooks or manual laborers in camps. Enslaved people were also forced to help build the Confederate Railroad. In the North, African Americans faced discrimination because of a federal law from 1792 barred them from enlisting, meaning they couldn't ban them from enlisting. They couldn't enlist. Lincoln and his advisors worried that allowing free African Americans to enlist in the Union Army would cause the border states where slavery was still legal to secede or to withdraw from the Union. So Frederick Douglass played an important role in helping convince Lincoln to allow African Americans to serve. After Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863, African American men were allowed to enlist in the Union forces. So here we have, by the end of the war, African Americans made up 10% of the Union forces. So 1 out of every 10 soldiers would have been African American by the end of the Civil War. All right, so let's go ahead and look at John W. Fields. In their words, an enslaved man from Kentucky. So again, another primary source coming straight from John W. Fields. At the beginning of the Civil War, I was still at this place as a slave. It looked at the first of the war as if the South would win, as most of the big battles were won by the South. This was because we slaves stayed at home and tended the farm and kept their families. To eliminate the solid support of the South, the Emancipation Act was passed, freeing all slaves. I did not realize that I was free until 1864. I immediately resolved to run away and join the Union Army, so my brother and I went to Owensboro, Kentucky, and tried to join. My brother was taken, but I was refused as being too young. I tried at Evansville, Terre Haute, and Indianapolis, but was unable to get in. I then tried to find work and was finally hired by a man at $7 a month. That was my first independent job. So this is from an interview conducted on September 7th of 1937 called Born in Slavery, Slave Narratives from the Federal Writers Project, 1936 to 1938. So here we have John Fields, who was an enslaved man from Kentucky. He didn't know that he was emancipated until a little bit after the Emancipation Proclamation was actually filed or passed into law. So now he's like, okay, now I'm free. What can I do? So him and his brother ran away. His brother was, they both tried to join the Union Army, but they took his brother, said he was too young, tried in many different places. They continued to say, no, you're too young, you're too young. Finally, he was able to find work and was hired by a man that was going to pay him to work, but they only paid him $7 a month, not $7 an hour, not $7 a week, $7 a month. So for a whole month's worth of work, he was paid $7. But he was happy because that was his first independent job, a job he had on his own and he got paid for.